Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. For those of you who don't know me, I am Ross Morlock. I'm Brake's CEO. Together, we're here to confront a difficult question today that no one wants to face, but everyone must be prepared for. If one of your employees was involved in a serious crash, would you know what to do? It's a privilege to be joined today by representatives from over 200 organisations and a great panel of speakers. This collective presence highlights both the shared risks that we all face and the opportunity we hold to make a real difference. Road crashes aren't just individual tragedies. They're a societal issue that we must all address. By being here today, you're showing a commitment to action that can help save lives and help prepare your organisation to better support your employees and their families should the worst happen. Thank you for being here today. Too often, road deaths and injuries are seen as an inevitable part of society, something society has tragically normalised. This must change. Behind every road death and serious injury is a family in turmoil, a grief-stricken family trying to navigate its way through the complex procedures that often follow a road crash. Behind every number is a family whose lives have been changed forever in an instant, a family that needs the right support and the right help. Today's webinar is part of Brake's Road Safety Week, our biggest annual campaign. This year, we're focusing on the theme, after the crash, every road victim counts. It's a time to pause and consider the real cost of road crashes, not just lives lost, but lives forever changed. If you haven't done so already, please sign up to Road Safety Week and show your support. When tragedy strikes, Brake is here through our National Road Victim Service, offering vital trauma-informed support to those struggling with unimaginable loss. This service is free, professional, and grounded in compassion, assisting close to 2,000 families a year through their darkest times. But the demand is high and the need is growing. Every bit of support, every commitment to safer practices, and every new advocate for road safety takes us closer to a day when no family has to suffer this kind of heartbreak. As part of this year's campaign, Brake has launched a Road Victims Charter, which sets out essential actions to ensure that road victims receive the respect, support, and justice they deserve. One crucial aspect of the Charter, and something Dr. Nikki Lester will delve into further during her presentation, is the need for national best practice guidance for employers, educators, and emergency responders. This ask is vital. Without clear national standards, responses can be inconsistent and inadequate, leaving victims and their families without the support they desperately need. Another core area covered within the Charter is the importance of lessons learned to prevent future death and injury, and in particular mandating and enhancing the use of data and reporting to understand crash causation and prevent future incidents. This is another vital area that will be discussed at today's webinar. You can find a full copy of our Road Victims Charter on our website. I spent Monday afternoon at Westminster launching the Road Victims Charter with members of the Brake team in the company of just the most incredibly brave and inspiring families who have lost loved ones in road crashes, who were there to share their stories with MPs who wanted to find out more about the Charter. Almost 1,700 people lost their lives on the UK's roads last year, with almost 30,000 suffering serious and life-changing injury. We have to do better than that. Before we move forward, I'd like to invite you all to join me in holding a minute's silence to remember and show respect to all those who have lost their lives on our roads and their loved ones who have been left behind. We'll pause for a minute now to do just that. Thank you. A few housekeeping points before we continue. The chat function, as well as your cameras and microphones, have been disabled due to the number of attendees. I can see we're almost up to 300 attendees this morning. Please use the Q&A option to submit your questions. You can upvote questions you're interested in, and we'll address as many as possible during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. The webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be shared with you on YouTube once it's available. Today's discussion isn't just about understanding, it's about action. Road crashes aren't inevitable, they're preventable. By learning, advocating, and implementing best practices, we can save lives and ensure that road victims receive the justice and the support that they deserve. Thank you for being here, for taking this commitment seriously, and for making road safety and road victim support a priority. Let's get started. Without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our webinar host today, Dan Campsall from Agilysys. Dan, over to you.
Great, thanks Ross. Thanks for that introduction and for framing our time together in that important context of the experiences of so many people across this country. And it's fantastic that we have got 300 plus participants here to explore this issue. For those of you who don't know me, Dan Campsall, I'm chair of an organisation called Agilysys and have spent well over 20 years working in road safety in a variety of roles, and also serve as the chair of the Parliamentary Advisory Council for Transport Safety. And it's just fantastic to hear from Ross and colleagues at Brake about that level of engagement that we are increasingly seeing now with parliamentarians who really do see this as an issue that influences their constituents and their communities, and starting to engage much more actively. And we are looking forward to seeing a new road safety strategy for the country as well in the coming months. So we're here because across businesses up and down the country, road risk is a significant issue. It's a long established fact that around a third of the road traffic crashes that happen on our network involve somebody who is traveling for work. That's excluding commuting. So a significant proportion of the risk that comes to our roads and the human and financial costs associated with that is related to the activities of those who are moving on our network because of a business need, because they're moving themselves or indeed goods around the country. And actually the annual risk of dying in a road traffic crash whilst driving for a business reason is greater than all other workplace accidents. So, employers in your place of employment, many of you will have high levels of health and safety regulation and process that you need to engage with, but outside of that workplace and on the roads of the UK is actually the place where most people experience that risk. And as various academics and researchers have demonstrated over the years, it is probably the most dangerous thing that a person will do during their working day or their working life is to travel on our highways. And this is a time when it's really important for us to be thinking about that, because the risks are changing. It's dynamic out there, and changes in practice are influencing the risks that we see and are exposed to. So as things like our buying habits have changed, so there's a great deal of change in the types of journeys that occur on our network, whether it's demand for groceries delivered to your door or parcel deliveries because we've moved much of our shopping online, or deliveries of takeaway food services, or indeed, sort of movement towards more urgent micro shopping instead of you going to the store, much of that stuff coming to you. We're seeing changing nature of traffic and therefore the risks associated with that, and the responsibilities on employers because of that change in the transport mix. So that means that we need to rethink our response, and it's great to be here working with Brake, who are very much at the heart of that process of continuing to think about how we should respond to the risks that are emerging, but also to care for those who are affected by those collisions when they occur. So in the time that we've got together today, I'm pleased to say we've got a great programme for the webinar, ostensibly in 4 parts. We've got a couple of great presentations to help you to think through that from an organisational perspective and some of the responses that we might need to make. We've also got the opportunity to hear from some lived experience about what it's like to be involved in a crash, and to explore how that then unfolds within an organisational context. And then we've got an opportunity for questions and answers. So as Ross has already said, we've got the Q&A option within Teams. It would be great if you get your questions in, because we're going to have the presentations first before the Q&A. Please make sure that you feed those questions in during the presentations. I can then keep a track of them, and if you upvote them, then those are some of the questions that we will take earliest in our conversation a little later on. So we do want you to be participatory in this. We want you to get as much value out of your time invested in this webinar as anything. So please do engage in the conversation. Make sure that you raise your questions and we can feed those into our time together today. So the first of our presentations comes from Mark Cartwright, and I'm delighted that Mark is with us today. And for those who don't know Mark, he is the head of the Commercial Vehicle Incident Prevention Programme at National Highways. So that's a network that manages a huge amount of the traffic that moves around England. And as well as his role within the CVIP, he also oversees Driving for Better Business. So many people on the call, I'm sure, will have come across DFBB. It's an outreach program that seeks to work with employers to help them think about the ways in which they can manage the risk of their fleet. Mark's somebody who's got an immense amount of experience to bring, both in relation to policy and operations, and has been working at a national level, certainly since his role in establishing the FTA's Van Excellence programme well over a decade ago. So it's great to have Mark with us. He's going to be joining us live for the Q&A session later, but we've now got a pre-record of his presentation. So I'm going to ask the team if they can roll the video. So it's looking like we might possibly have some difficulties with the video. I'm guessing that what we could do is call on Mark to present live, if that's feasible. Though Teams has not necessarily been a joy to him this morning. So let's give it another try with the video. Are we drawing a blank on that one, Leslie? Is this going to work for us?
It's just not sharing for some reason. Let me try one more time. It's not sharing.
We can see your screen, Leslie.
Yeah,
So we can see where it looks like you need to press play, but it's not.
Let me try once more.
Hello, my name's Mark Cartwright. I'm Head of Commercial Vehicle Incident Prevention and Driving for Better Business at National Highways. So really pleased that our friends at Brake have asked us to come along and get involved in their work for Road Safety Week. So I've got a short presentation which hopefully will give you a bit of an idea of what we do, what our priorities are, and hopefully it's something which aligns well with your thoughts about incident prevention on our networks. So with no further ado, let me do a quick introduction about National Highways. Everybody thinks they know who we are and what we do, but it's probably just as well just to position this a little bit. National Highways are responsible for the 4,300 miles of motorway and what we call APTR, all-purpose truck roads, big fast A roads, which tend to be between towns and cities, ports, etc., etc. Those roads are less than 4% of the roads in England by length, but they carry something like a third of all traffic and over 60% of freight traffic in the UK, and that figure doesn't include all the vans that are using our network. So 60% of HGV traffic is actually on the strategic route network. The England bit's probably worth fleshing out. Our remit, our licence from DFT is to operate, maintain and improve those roads in England, but that isn't to say we're not very influential on other networks, local authority networks, and also that we're not influential in the other nations and regions of Great Britain, South Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, which we are. What do I do? Good question. I wonder myself sometimes. I've got two roles at National Highways, as I mentioned right at the beginning. I head up our commercial vehicle incident prevention team. So fundamentally a team of project managers looking for interventions, good ideas, wizard wheezes, whatever we can come up with, which will hopefully go some way to reducing the severity and frequency of crashes involving vehicles which are being driven for work, primarily vans and trucks. I'm also, and here's the most civil service job title you will ever hear in your life, I'm the SRO, the Senior Responsible Officer for our Driving for Better Business engagement campaign, and a little bit more on that later, but the good news is it's all very good and it's all free for people to use. Both of my teams are judged on a single KPI at the end of the year, which is the number of people who manage to kill and injure themselves on our roads who are driving commercial vehicles at the time, so van and truck drivers, so single KPI. And it goes without saying we have an ambitious target as part of our Road to Zero Harm campaign, and the clues in the title there is to bring those casualties down to zero, certainly the fatalities down to zero. And of course that is an enormously challenging target to have, but it's the only target you really can have in this kind of environment, isn't it? The realisation, though, is that we can do all the things that we're doing at the moment and we won't reach that target. We could probably do 10, maybe 100 times more of what we're doing. We still wouldn't reach the target. We need to be thinking differently. And the reason we're so pleased to be involved in webinars like this is actually Brake, other partners, and indeed yourselves are all part of something different. So hopefully this presentation will get you thinking, maybe even inspire you to step up and be supportive of our ambitions. So to try and put this into context, 5. 5 is a really important number to us in the world that my teams operate. 5 is the number of people who will typically die on our roads every day. Today, tomorrow, the day after, 5 people. That's 5 police officers having to make a long walk, knock on somebody's door and tell them, guess what, your world has exploded. So it's a big number. One of the things that frustrates me immensely is we've kind of become a little bit blind to this. We kind of think that maybe it's the cost of doing business, it's the cost of using our roads. Of course it isn't. 5 people don't die on the rail network every day as an example. And one of the things that agitates me a little bit is that as a nation, we don't really pick up on this. 5 people, that's 1,700 people a year that will die in crashes on our roads. It may not be their fault. They might be completely innocent bystanders, but 1,700 people. And that's why, again, the Brake relationship is very positive, because I know we share the same ambitions about reducing that figure down to the only acceptable figure of 0. And one of the things that I bore my leadership team to death with is the fact that, you know what, there's a really, in my mind, not easy, but there's low-hanging fruit that we can go at here. It's very difficult to stop a crash involving somebody just driving on their own business, tootling around doing their own kind of things. Very, very difficult. However, an awful lot of the vehicles and the drivers on our roads at any one time are only there because they're driving for work. 20 million is our kind of estimate, and I'll, excuse me, a little bit of an admission perhaps, but our data on journey purpose isn't always as good as people perhaps think it is. We're very reliant on our police colleagues to capture that data at the scene of a crash. We had a daft idea a while ago to try and work out how many people were driving for work. Wouldn't it be great if we could go and freeze a mile of motorway, go and knock on everybody's window and ask them why they were there? No, we didn't manage to get that signed off, I'm afraid. Not because we're not good at stopping miles of motorway, we're pretty good at that. But we couldn't get the health and safety sign off, if you like, to go down onto the network and start knocking on people's windows. So we had a different idea. We know from vehicle registration numbers that broadly there's about 500,000 trucks in the UK, so they're being driven for work purposes. There's about 5.2 million vans, a figure that's been growing consistently over the last 15, 20 years or so. It's about 1 in 9 of all traffic now is a van. The great majority of those are going to be driven for work purposes, so that gets me to 5.7 million at work vehicles. We then get into traditional company cars. There's about 800,000 of those, so that gets me to what, about 6.5 million vehicles driven for work. And then we get into the world of grey fleet, where there are all kind of estimates of the numbers of grey fleet drivers on our roads, anywhere between 10 and 25 million. I picked up when I was doing a bit of online research on this. So we just went, you know what, let's say it's about 13 million. One, because it's a fairly conservative number, but rather conveniently, it all adds up to about 20 million. 20 million is about half of all the vehicles registered in the UK. So I'd make an argument that we can probably ought to be able to influence the behaviours and choices, the decisions of drivers on at least half of the vehicles out on our road. Now, I suspect that's a quite conservative figure, because if you went down to a piece of our motorway and just watched the vehicle go past on any kind of work day, it'd be way more than half of the vehicles out there are driven for work purposes. But we do have this lever, we do have this ability to influence. Something I want to get you thinking about in terms of the risk is driving is easily the riskiest thing that most of us do on any regular kind of basis, but we just take it for granted, don't we? Everybody thinks they're a better driver than they actually are. Everybody thinks the risk of them getting hurt or worse in a crash is negligible. And have a think about this. There's about a 1 in 25,000 chance of an adult of working age in the UK getting killed in a crash this year. About 1 in 25,000 chance. Now, if like me, you have a go at the lottery, the odds of you winning the lottery on any particular week is about 1 in 43 million, or 1 year is about 1 in 43 million. So it kind of puts it into context a little bit. You're 8,000 times more likely to die in a crash than you are to win the lottery this year. So hopefully that gets you thinking a little bit about the scenario that we find ourselves in. The big themes that we've been picking up on for the last 18, 24 months or so is fundamentally about the fact that when we look at the causations of crashes on our networks, we discover that, you know what, vehicles don't crash. People crash. They just happen to be in a vehicle at the time. And this is an image we've been using in some of our conferences and our presentations for a good while now. We're just trying to get across the fact that it's not that vehicle that crashed, it's Colin who's driving the truck that crashed. It's not the lad in the Mini in lane 1 that crashed. It's not the Mini that crashed, it's the lad who was driving it that crashed. It's not the guy behind him with the rather attractive woolly hat that crashed. He crashed. And there's a backstory to all of these. It's all fictional, but hopefully it kind of gets the message across. And the video that this relates to is up on our drivingchange.info website, which we'll reference at the end of today's presentation. What we do know is it's not the vehicles that crash, as I say, it's the people that crash. And why do they crash? We talk about what we call the 4 known unknowns, and you'll see a little bit about those in a slide or two. But basically, people crash because they're distracted, they're fatigued, they're impaired, or they have medical conditions. Virtually every crash, when we dial back, has got at least one of those factors, possibly a couple or 3 of those factors involved. And the only reason we call them the known unknowns is, although we know they're there, we're not necessarily sure of the proportionality and what the overlaps are, and there's a lot of research going on at the moment. So we talk a lot about driver roadworthiness, link it to these four unknown unknowns of distraction, impairment, fatigue, and medical conditions. And I always try and present it as a bit of a Venn diagram because it just shows the potential for overlaps. But I want you to think about this. I think there's a fifth reason. And the fifth reason is attitude. And again, when we start digging into some of these incidents and trying to understand what went on, is you'll find it's not even driver attitude, to be honest. Some drivers have good attitude, some drivers have bad attitude. Attitudes shift and move around. But it's the attitude of that organisation, it's the attitude of that supervisor who is pretty sure that there's an issue with a driver but doesn't engage for whatever reason. It's the attitude of the middle management there who perhaps fear that there's a bit of an issue but don't want to raise the issue because it might impinge on their delivery schedules, their KPIs, etc., so they'll turn a blind eye. It's the attitude of the board, of that chief exec, who may be blissfully unaware that they're sitting on a time bomb in terms of the way their vehicles are being driven for work and everything that goes along with that. And if you start getting your heads around that attitude and the known unknowns in there, the four known unknowns, I think you can make massive steps. I love this still. It's from a very, very good Australian road safety advert, which you might have come across. It was the day after the state, and I can never remember which state in Australia it was, announced their road safety casualty figures from previous 12 months. And the only thing that was fixed in this bit of video is your man to the right of the screen in the maroon jersey was told to say 70 when he was asked a question. So he's walking down the road, what looked like a local TV news crew suddenly approach him, stick a microphone under his nose and say, what do you think about the road safety figures, which were announced last night? 140 people or whatever the number was died on our roads last year. It's almost terrible, isn't it? Is it too many? Yeah, of course it's too many people. Okay. How many people is acceptable then? And he went, well, 70. As he said 70 people walk around the corner. That's his mom, his dad, his wife, his kids, his neighbours, the people he works with, his mates he goes down the pub with, etc. And that's really the message, is this is personal. These aren't statistics. These are people, these are families who are devastated. They're lost loved ones who are lost from their friends and their families. We need to take it personally. So, having set the scene, what are the takeaways from this situation? I think the number one I'd like you to go away with is just that recognition and understanding that risk, the risk element of it, because driving for most of us is easily the most dangerous thing we do on any kind of regular basis. How can you improve your performance against this within your organisation? Policies. First and foremost is make sure you've got the right kind of policies in place across all of the risk factors involved with driving. Everything from distraction, use of mobile phones, speed, fitness to drive, vehicle roadworthiness. If you haven't got a policy and you're not clear in setting out your expectations of your drivers, their supervisors, their managers, etc., you really will struggle to improve in this area. And think about going beyond compliance. One of the things that grinds my gears a little bit is seeing policies which are basically just saying, yeah, don't break the law. Go beyond it. Just having a policy that says don't speed at more than 70 miles an hour or don't use your handheld phone. That's not a policy. That's just a requirement to abide by the law. So phones is probably a decent example. There's loads of evidence that tells us that the use of hands-free phones is just as dangerous as the use of handheld phone. So take this opportunity in your policies, be very clear about your expectations. Learn from history. Investigate incidents, minor incidents, more serious incidents. Learn from the experience. Why did the incident happen? Dig into it. And use the 5 whys methodology. Okay, what happened? Well, I crashed into them. Why did you crash into them? Well, I didn't see them. Why didn't you see them? Dig into it and find out what the background, what the root cause of those incidents are, and share that knowledge, that information across the correct attitude with just culture within an organisation. A lot of businesses talk about having a blame-free culture. It's not a blame-free culture. You may well go through the investigation process and blame may well actually end up somewhere, but it's having a just culture, a consistent culture that you're taking everybody's views on board and you're carrying out that investigation in a proper manner. And there's lots of advice and support we can provide in there. The other reason I say it's not a fleet issue, I've spent most of my working career working with fleets and fleet managers, and they're a great bunch of people by and large. And you could easily imagine a fleet manager on site going up to one of their van or their truck drivers and going, mate, your vehicle looks a bit heavy. Would you mind going and get it weighed again for us? Just double check. Or I don't think your lights were working when you came in, or your tyres look a bit flat, or whatever. And off they'll go. They'll check the vehicle out and they'll come back and it's a yes or no answer. Yes, it's okay, or no, it isn't. And if it isn't, they know what to do about it. I find it quite difficult to imagine that fleet manager wandering up to one of their drivers and saying, mate, you look absolutely knackered. Have you had any sleep? It doesn't happen so much, does it? But as we've already established, it's the driver where the risk is. So for me, this is very much a health and safety management. And my experience is, again, when health and safety management get involved with the management of fleet risk, road risk, my God, they go through it like a dose of salts. They know what to do. They tend to have the authority within the organisation at a senior level to make things happen. We found ourselves at an exhibition a while ago next door to a stand from a very well-known coffee company. So we spent 3 days scrounging cups of coffee from these guys. And day one, I had a conversation with a guy turned out to be one of our ops directors. And it was very much along the lines of, well, what do you do then? Oh, we're National Highways. I run a team that's trying to stop people driving from work crashing into each other quite so much. Oh, okay. What do you do? And he looked at me like an idiot and said, coffee. Okay. Do you have any exposure to road risk? No, not really. We do coffee. Day 3 of the event, as everybody's shutting up shop, he came wandering over and he said, look, forgive me, I have a little bit of an admission to make. We do have an exposure to road risk. It's just been pointed out to me that I've got 80 service engineers in vans. Can you meet my colleague here? He's our health and safety director. Can you make it go away? And working with them, it didn't take them long. They were brilliant. So they went from basically having no road risk management whatsoever to actually having an award-winning road risk structure in there now. So again, health and safety is the key. And we can help with this. As I say, I run the Driving for Better Business campaign, DFBB as we tend to call it. When you're after the presentation, please go and have a look at Driving for Better Business's website. If you like it, it's all free. As promised, you no catch. There's some really high quality materials in there, loads of resources around vans and van drivers to try and support the management of them. There are driver CPC packages in there ready made for your HGV drivers. Policies we've talked about quite a lot. We've got a very, very well received policy builder tool in there, which will help you build policies if you need them. And equally, if you've got policies, double check your policies against these and make sure there's no gaps. And talking about gaps, we've got a really good risk gap analysis process in there, which will hopefully shine a really strong light on where your areas of weakness and areas for improvement are within your management of road risk. And watch this space. Coming down the tubes fairly soon, we'll have an incident investigation guide, as we've mentioned, and we've just commissioned a guide to maintaining driver roadworthiness to try and support organisations with the way that they manage the roadworthiness of their drivers as well as they manage the roadworthiness of their vehicles. And here's a final message from me, is use your superpowers. We've all got superpowers. We've all got superpowers to influence people around us, whether it's our friends, our families, our peer group, within our organisation. We can influence the attitude of your organisation to the management of a road risk. Your organisation has superpowers, powers to be very clear about your expectations and the way that your supply chain and your suppliers manage their road risk. There's advice you can provide to clients. There's advice you can provide to your own people within your organisation. It's clearly in all of our interest to make sure our people turn up for work again tomorrow because they've been involved in a crash. So use your superpower. And we're working on something which I'll share with you. It's quite an early version of this, but it's our do the right thing tick list. It's not about moving away from the risk of prosecution, the risk of enforcement. The chances of that for most organisations are actually fairly remote. It's about doing the right kind of thing. So my message is, please manage your managed fleet risk well. The vehicles that have got your name written on the side of them. Lots of support available, as I say, through DFBB. Manage your difficult fleet risk just as brilliantly. I see a fair number of organisations where they manage their liveried vehicles very well, but their grey fleet and other difficult fleet not so well. And that's where a lot of the risk is within an organisation. Ensure your supply chain are very clear of your expectations. You're expecting them to behave as well and to manage their road risk as well as you do, and you've got the power to do that. And ensure they're also clear that of your expectations, that they not just manage their own fleet, but also they are very clear in their expectations of their supply chain who are working on your programs and projects as well. Share your commitment and knowledge with your clients and customers. You've got relationships with organisations. Just, you know, we're doing some good stuff on this. Perhaps you're not aware of this. Perhaps we can help you build that relationship and encourage them to share. And share knowledge with your people. Your workforce is, do they know what to do in the case of a breakdown? Do they know how to check their vehicle to ensure as best as they can that it doesn't break down? As examples, are they aware of the risk of excess speed? Are they aware of the risks of mobile phone usage? Just share the knowledge with them and encourage them to share with their friends, families, peer groups. Celebrate success. I think people respond far more to a success than they do being chastised for a failure. Learn from those failings though. Make sure everybody's aware of your ambitions and what you're going to do. And it ain't an easy job. It's not going to happen overnight, so just keep on keeping on with it. And I don't think I could have put this any better than my favourite fictional football manager. Doing the right thing is never the wrong thing. So don't do this because you're trying to avoid prosecution and facing up to the traffic commissioners and all the rest of it. Do it because it's the right thing to do. It's about managing the well-being of your team, your organisation. It's about sharing best practices with anybody on our roads that could find themselves getting themselves into trouble. Forgive me, I've had a few gremlins with the presentation, but I hope it hangs together for you. I'm always very happy to talk. Please, you know, if there's something you want to raise with us, you've got any bright ideas that I can shamelessly steal, please either email me, give me a phone call. And again, do me a favour, grab a cup of coffee and have a look at the drivingchange.info website and the drivingforbetterbusiness.com websites, which is where all that good stuff lives. It's all free. It's all really good. Please use it. If you like it, tell your friends. If you don't like it, tell me and we'll fix it. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that, Mark. And as I say, Mark will be joining us for the Q&A that's coming up in a little while. And I can see that a number of you have already started to fire in questions that relate to that. And some of those I very much want to pick up in that discussion a little bit later on. So we're going to change tack ever so slightly now because we are going to hear a story from somebody who actually has some lived experience of being involved in a crash whilst driving for work. Now, in comparison to some people's experience of road traffic crashes, I'm glad to say that the details and outcome of this story are not so tragic, but that doesn't mean that it was not traumatic. So as ever, in sessions that are run by Brake and those of us working in the road safety space, if there's anything in this that resonates with your own experience and does stir up negative feelings for you, please do feel free to step away or to mute the webinar for a time. But I'd really like to introduce you to Lisa Malone. Lisa works for Aon, a global risk management and insurance company, supporting clients to manage aspects of their business, such as road risk. As a haulage and risk consultant, Lisa is used to spending large parts of her working week driving for business, as many people on this call will do, and visiting client sites. Well, early one morning, Lisa was making a familiar journey up onto the M4 and heading towards London when things went dramatically wrong. Whilst indicating and merging into traffic, Lisa realised that there was another car cutting sharply across the carriageway at speed. She hit the brakes and swerved to avoid the immediate contact, but Lisa was then caught by a van and rapidly lost control of the car as it started to spin. With her car across the carriageway, Lisa realised that there was another danger looming as a 44-ton truck was heading straight towards her. With nowhere to go, the HGV ploughed into her. Now, when I first heard this story, I'm immediately thinking of the collision dynamics and the potential crash forces at play and thinking, I can't see how this ends well. But incredibly, Lisa walked away from that crash without physical injuries. But as many of you will appreciate, an incident of this severity can still leave us with scars of a different kind. So here to talk about that and her rehabilitation, I'm delighted to say that Lisa joins us now. So great to have you with us, Lisa.
Cheers. Thank you, Dan.
So first of all, Lisa, I just want to take you back to sort of the immediate aftermath of the crash. Like, what happened? What did you do, and how did you get yourself out of that situation?
It's a bit of an odd one. I feel like I went into autopilot. So when my car stopped, because it was spinning from the impact of hitting the van, and then when the truck hit into my car as well, I ended up facing the wrong way on the motorway. So I was facing all of the traffic coming towards me. And I think from being in my job, I've dealt with haulage clients, drivers that have been involved in claims, and also a part of my job is constantly giving advice to clients on what to do if you're involved in an incident. So it's nearly imprinted on my brain, the steps on what to do. And that's what kicked in. It was pure autopilot. So it was hazard lights, switch off the car, grabbed my stuff that was safe to do, my bag, my work laptop. The door was a little bit like dented in and my airbags had gone off. So I was able to push that and kick it out. And then it was like, right, I just need to make sure everyone else was okay. So I had hit a van, so it was making sure that he was okay, and the HGV driver, and there was another van involved as well. So there was no injuries. Everyone was fine, but everyone was really shaken up by what had happened. And especially, I mean, the HGV driver, he just thought I was a complete goner. Like when he was just seeing that I was okay, and everyone was just so supportive, really, really lovely. I was like, brilliant, okay, everyone's okay, next step. And I can't remember at the time, I think if I phoned the police or National Highways, quoting the nearest motorway marker and just saying, look, my car is blocking off 2 lanes, so the motorway, that needs to be shut off. We don't need an ambulance, nobody's injured. And then National Highways came out to get my car off of the road, clear up the debris. And then the recovery truck had come. So after I got off the phone, then I was like, right, okay, I need to get videos, I need to get photographs, I need to get everyone's contact details. It's quite strange looking back and talking about it now, but that's what it was. It was just pure autopilot.
So that all seems incredibly level-headed, except for the fact that, sort of, it's like, I really need to think about gathering up my personal effects and my laptop. I mean, like this, I'm not sure that goes through everyone's head. And I guess it demonstrates the value, actually, of people having worked through that process in advance and having an understanding of how to respond. But at what point did it actually sort of dawn on you the severity of the crash that you had been involved with?
So I'm probably talking from an autopilot point of view. So I think it was after I got home, and then after reporting it to insurers, I think the initial emotion that I was feeling was anger to the driver who had initially caused it and obviously driven off. And then when I was speaking to my family and friends and kind of sending them, the pictures and videos, and they were just in complete shock that I had managed to get out of that in one piece. And then I think when I was just sitting there, so after autopilot probably switched off, and then it was the realization of what had happened. And you replay it in your mind. And I probably for other people that have been involved in accidents and crashes as well, is in that moment, it's happening in slow motion, but it's like a number of seconds, and you're replaying, like, hitting the side of the van, the truck coming towards me, and replaying that, and just thinking, And I remember when it was happening and I felt so out of control of what was happening. I genuinely, hand on my heart, I thought my number is up. There is no way I'm going to make this out okay and in one piece. And then when the car had stopped and then I was in one piece, it was an absolute miracle. And even though I was driving an Audi A6 at the time, and you know, they're fairly bulletproof cars, I am quite a spiritual person as well. I'm not religious, but I'm very spiritual, and I do believe that somebody was genuinely looking, like, to get out of that accident, no injuries, like not a scrape on my head. And I remember one of the police officers at the time was like, you're probably in shock at the moment, so your adrenaline's going to be going, which obviously it was to get me through that. Your body goes into fight or flight. She said, but tomorrow, she said, you're going to be aching, your neck, your shoulders, because obviously my airbags had gone off. And I remember waking up the next morning. This happened in March 2023, and it was just the most beautiful morning, gorgeous blue sky, didn't feel any pain or aches. And I remember just feeling so glad to have gotten out of that car in one piece, not injured. I could have been lying in a hospital bed. I could have sustained serious injuries, broken legs, arms, cracked ribs, and I didn't. And yeah, and just, I mean, chatting to people at work as well. It just takes, I think when you're talking to people about it, it hits home.
That's what I was going to ask. I mean, you know, sort of all of us, I guess, will handle it in our own unique way, a situation like that, as I'm sure Nikki's going to come on to talk about. But what were the things that were most helpful for you in terms of processing what you had been through?
So for me, I think I'm very much able to talk about my emotions and my feelings. I wouldn't bottle it up and put on a brave face and, you know, call my boss, who has been absolutely incredible throughout the whole experience, Phil. But just being able to talk about how it actually did affect me and how lucky I was to get out of it in one piece. And that morning, the next morning when I woke up, because my boss, Phil, was like, take as much time off as you need. Take a few weeks. And I was like, I don't need a few weeks off. Just need a couple of days just to kind of get my head around it. Still dealing with insurers and stuff. And yeah, just that morning, the next morning, just been so grateful to not have been injured. Nobody else is injured. And I went off for a run, and then I came back and I did some yoga, and I just felt this massive sense of gratitude. And I look after myself quite well physically. You know, I'm into running, the gym, and fitness. So from a physical point of view, I knew what to do, getting out, getting fresh air, but also on a mentally, I'm quite big into my ice baths, my saunas, breath work. I tap into all of that as well. And obviously with work, we have an employee assistance program. So from a counselling point of view, I had that offered to me as well. I'm very lucky to have very close friends who are qualified therapists and psychologists, so I can tap into them at any time, and I get all that for free, the therapy. And I'm really lucky to have an incredible bunch of friends and family and work colleagues who I could speak to about it as well. So yeah, I was very lucky in that sense.
Yeah, sounds great. I mean, so you've touched on there at a couple of points, the role of your employer and how supportive they've been. What support did Aon put in around you as a follow-up to that? Because obviously you were driving for work at the time and needed to return to your duties. So just tell us a little bit about, you know, how you found that. Yeah,
so my boss, Phil Morton, he was incredibly supportive from the get-go. So I had the leeway of no work pressures, forget work, get back to you. And my colleague, Jeremy Hubbard, I work really closely alongside Jeremy on a day-to-day basis. He's a senior motor risk consultant for Aon. And he suggested going on a post-collision training course with one of our training suppliers, TTC. Because my confidence was just, and my anxiety getting back on the motorway. So I had to pick up my new car a week after the accident, and that was in Gloucester. I lived in Bristol at the time. And I remember just picking up the car and thinking, how am I going to drive this back on the motorway? And just merging back on, and my heart was just like the hammers of hell, going really, really quick. I mean, could have had a panic attack, but just felt such anxiety and feeling that every car was going to go into the side of me. Managed to get it home, and driving on like smaller roads, country roads, in through town felt absolutely fine. Once the motorway came into my head, that's when my anxiety hits the roof. And when Jeremy was like, we think that you should actually do this post-collision training course, which, Dan, honestly, is a massive reason why I'm back on the motorway driving again. And I would recommend it to absolutely everyone. I always speak to clients about it, especially when we talk about post-incident investigation and that follow-up care for drivers as well. So I met with one of their driver assessors somewhere local to me at Bristol in the time. Incredible person, John. Went through the circumstances of the crash again, and how it happened, could it have been avoided? And he said, okay, Lisa, we're just going to go out with you now for 20 minutes. I'm just going to assess your driving. And just going back to stuff that Mark was saying in his presentation, we all think we're brilliant drivers. And I thought, well, he's obviously not going to have anything to say about my driving. So driving along, and then we park up, and it's like, oh, Lisa, I think you've built up a few little habits there, haven't you? And I thought, no, John, I feel like I was fine. He goes, well, first of all, you've got one hand on the steering wheel. So in the event of an accident, what you do, the other hand goes up. So you've lost that millisecond of braking, and for your back as well, indicating a little bit too late. And I thought, okay, fair enough. I'll take that constructive criticism. I remember it. And then he said, okay, now we're going to get on the motorway, and just building me up and giving me tips on it's risk assessing yourself, obviously, when you're out on the road, but everyone else around you. So ahead, aside, and behind, you need to be constantly vigilant. Can't really drift into autopilot when you're driving. You can't trust the other people are going to make the right decision. And the first couple of times merging on was awful. Didn't do okay, panicked quite a bit, came off, but came back on. And I actually managed to drive through the place where I did have my accident as well. And I just felt like I just achieved something massive. And that training course went on for about half a day. And then at the end, I just felt so grateful. I said, I just feel like I've massively overcome that hurdle. And he said, you just need to keep getting back on the motorway. And breath work, breathing. So breathing calms your nervous system. So for the first couple of months after, I don't think I did a client visit for about 2 months after. And there was no pressure from work to do it, because we can sometimes do reviews and meetings with clients on Teams. And then, I mean, with my job, I could be as far as, I could be up in Manchester, I could be in London. And now it is just second nature getting on the motorway. I don't need to do that deep thinking, but those skills and those extra little tips have just ingrained in my head now, and it's absolutely completely changed it for me. And just having that support from work to getting on that course as well was brilliant.
That's great. Lisa, we're going to have to sort of pause here and move on to Nikki's presentation, but you're going to be with us for the Q&A, and I'm sure there'll be loads of people on this webinar who, I mean, just delighted to hear the outcome of what could have been such a tragic set of circumstances, but also, impressed at an employer and a work environment that has been obviously so helpful to you and helping you to kind of rehabilitate and get back. So thank you for sharing your story, and we'll see you again in the Q&A in a couple of minutes' time. So we're going to move on to the next of our presentations now, which is from Dr. Nicola Lester. I get to go to quite a lot of road safety events and conferences, and if I'm honest, like quite a lot of the presentations tend to sort of get a bit blurry, and those are just the ones that I'm giving. But one that has really stood out for me in recent months was I got to hear Nikki talk about trauma-informed response, and it was one of those sort of shining lights. So I need to see the issues that we address really differently. So delighted that Nikki is here now to share from her immense experience. So I'll not say any more, but hand over to you, Nikki, and let you take the floor.
Thank you very much. No pressure with that introduction. I will just share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen. First of all, good morning, and thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome to this final session, which looks specifically at organisational best practice and responding to road traffic incidents in the workplace. First of all, a confession. So as Lisa was talking, I updated my presentation in a couple of areas, which I'll talk about just to capture some of the best practice which came out in her story. Really, aside from the legal and the moral and the ethical obligation to make sure that employees and their families who are affected by road traffic incidents receive the right support at the right time and delivered in the right way, there's also a lot of evidence out there in the literature which talks about how institutional betrayal and experiences of what we call moral injury can compound distress in the aftermath of a traumatic incident. So when we talk about having organisational responses which are about best practice, it is about both fulfilling that legal, moral and ethical obligation that we've talked about so far today, but in recognition that if we don't fulfil that, then the impacts on outcomes from a psychological perspective can be really significant for employees and also for their families as well. So when we talk about organisational responses to trauma, it's really important that we start from a place of really recognising that the response of the organisation has the capacity to both be a really important source of support, or it can exacerbate stress and trauma, and sometimes it can do both, depending on what point in the process the organisation responds. And so what we're looking to do with our organisational best practice is to really make sure that the organisational response doesn't do any further harm, and where possible provides care, compassion and support instead. So our baseline is that we do no further harm, and where possible we do some good in terms of how we respond. And Lisa really spoke about this in her story. She mentioned several times about how supportive her manager was, and how that made a huge difference to her being able to make sense of, process and move forward from those experiences. So I'm going to talk today in this really quite brief presentation about introducing a framework for practice around our organisational responses, and we will be using what's referred to as a trauma-informed approach. When we talk about trauma-informed practice, what we're really saying is thinking about that idea of doing no harm and seeking out opportunities to do some good. So what we're wanting to do is to start by understanding and accounting for the impact of trauma in how we engage with victims and their families, with employees and their families, and working to mitigate its effects wherever and however possible. Ultimately, we want to reduce the potential for re-traumatization and harm, and to actively seek out opportunities to provide support and comfort instead. And we can do that by integrating 6 principles of a trauma-informed approach. And these are around establishing safety, offering choice and restoring control, supporting coping, facilitating connections, responding to identity and context, and building strengths. What I'll do is I'll talk through each of these in a little bit more detail. I'm going to draw on examples from my practice, not just working as a clinical consultant for Break, but also some broader work working with organisations both in the UK and overseas in response to a traumatic incident, to just try and hopefully bring to life what we actually talk about with these 6 principles. The idea being that I hope what you'll take away is some really kind of pragmatic ideas for what we'd be looking for in terms of best practice in the organisational response. So if I start with safety, when we talk about establishing safety, what we're actually looking for is nothing more than just honesty and absolute clarity about what happens in the aftermath of an incident. So this is around really having some good, effective lines of communication, making sure that information is shared about any processes which happen either externally or internally, essentially explaining what you're doing, when you're going to do it, and how you're going to do it. Making sure that any support is made accessible, and I'll talk a little bit more about the different forms of support as well. Thinking about how those affected, both directly and indirectly, can be given information and educated about the effects of trauma. When we respond particularly to a workplace incident and trauma in the workplace, we need to be remembering that it's not just the person who's directly impacted who's going to be affected. And we also need to pay attention to people who are perhaps on the periphery of an incident as well, and be drawing them into our response, or at the very least making sure that they're aware of access to support. In many organisations, it's very much about promoting a no blame culture. But at the same time, when we're promoting that no blame culture, we also need to be demonstrating some reassurance about the processes that are going to be initiated by an organisation for accountability and learning. And I guess one of the things to say is that in my experience, organisations can do some incredible work in the aftermath of a traumatic incident. But if that's not communicated, if what they're doing isn't shared, then it's not going to be best practice. So to give a very brief example, I very recently worked on an incident that happened with a company in Ukraine. They deployed contractors to work in Ukraine, providing security. One of the contractors became very unwell, and the other contractor did everything right to make sure that they had the medical support that they needed, but that wasn't communicated to the person who was medically unwell. And so the aftermath of that was that they experienced a real sense of feeling betrayed, let down, a loss of trust, simply because that hadn't been communicated at the time. The other aspect that I've since added from listening to Lisa's presentation around establishing safety is thinking about physical safety in the aftermath of a road traffic collision. She talked about anxiety, very understandable anxiety when she gets back in the car again, and particularly when she goes onto a motorway. And so when we're thinking about establishing safety, we also do need to be paying attention to physical safety as well. We don't need to look far to know that we don't want anxious drivers on the road. So thinking about safety is about emotional safety in terms of psychological well-being, but also going beyond that to think about physical safety as well. What can we do to rebuild confidence, and to think about what physical things and practical things people might need in the aftermath of an incident. Our second principle is one which is possibly the most important, and this is all about offering choice and restoring a sense of control. Anyone who's ever experienced stress, struggle, adversity or trauma will remember how much they felt that they were out of control and utterly powerless. And so what we would do in any organisational response is actively seek out opportunities to give those who are affected choices. And that could be choices about when and how they participate in organisational processes. It could be choices about the type of support, when they want to access that support. It could be choices around, what they need to happen next in the workplace. But what we're looking to do by offering those choices, no matter how small those choices are, all of that is contributing to a sense of restoring control. Our next principle is around supporting coping. One of the things that often happens in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic incident is that everybody assumes that people will need some kind of formal psychological support, or they'll start to talk about things like post-traumatic stress disorder, and there'll be a lot of judgment and assumption around what people ought to be doing in the aftermath of a traumatic incident. When we talk about supporting coping, and when we talk in particular about a trauma-informed approach, what we're doing is we're working on the assumption that somebody is coping in the best way that they know how. And our emphasis should be on supporting however they're coping, whatever that looks like. And we can also support coping by going beyond the emotional and psychological impact of an incident to think about the information that they might need to help them to make sense of and to process their experience. For example, information about what will happen next, updates about any investigation processes, either internal or external. The other aspect that's really important for supporting coping, particularly on the part of the organisation, is the validation and acknowledgement of somebody's experience and its impact. And this is really best provided by someone senior within an organisation to lend credibility to any response. So even if a senior person in the organisation isn't directly involved in delivering the response, they need to show up at some point. They need to say something at some point, be it via email or letter. But what that does is lend credibility and validity, and it acknowledges that somebody's been impacted. And that becomes really important for thinking about the relationship between a company and an employee. Our next principle is about facilitating connections, and this kind of happens in two different parts. So it could be support for a person's family, depending on what's happened. So just thinking about if somebody has been seriously injured, or if there's been a fatality, thinking beyond what's going on in the workplace to what's going on outside of the workplace in people's homes and in their families. And so that may extend to picking up a family liaison role as well, particularly in a serious injury where there's going to be perhaps a lengthy hospital stay or a need for ongoing liaison with a family. And the other aspects around facilitating connections is about mobilising opportunities for peer support in the workplace. So again, Lisa alluded to this in her presentation about having a supportive manager, supportive colleagues. And what we would look to do in the aftermath of any traumatic incident in the workplace is to really think through who's been impacted by what's happened and where are those opportunities to bring people together, to really mobilise networks of support which already exist within the workplace and to strengthen them in the aftermath of a traumatic incident. One of the things that we would often use in response to an incident, particularly an incident which may have impacted a number of people, is something called a crisis management brief. And a crisis management brief is a technique which is adapted from another model called critical incident stress management. And this is a really great template for doing, I suppose we would term it a debrief in response to a critical or traumatic incident. And it can be done with individuals or it can be done with a number of different people who've been impacted. And the content of this would really be about making sure that everyone's getting the information at the same time, so giving them up-to-date and accurate information. And this is then that opportunity to relay any corporate messages from senior leaders or credible leaders to lend that validity and acknowledgement to what's happened. It's about providing information and education about the potential psychological impact of the incident, any kind of expected responses, and the availability of welfare and psychological support. So part of the other aspect around a crisis management brief is really about empowering people to start to monitor and check out for themselves how they're doing so that they remain very alert to what's normal and what might be problematic if it gets worse or if it is sustained over a period of time. Again, one of the things that we look to do in the aftermath of a traumatic incident is to try and avoid pathologizing normal responses to trauma. So in the aftermath of a trauma, it's absolutely normal that somebody might be struggling with anxiety. They might be thinking all the time about what's happened. They might no longer feel safe when they're getting in a car, for example. They might be having dreams or nightmares. They might be thinking all the time about what's happened. And that would be a very normal response to a traumatic incident. And that normally demonstrates to us that the mind is working really hard to make sense of and process traumatic material. However, what we would also say from a clinical perspective is if that carries on beyond a kind of 4 to 6 week point, if it's not changing or perhaps it's getting worse, that might be when we would start to think about whether or not there is a need for more formal assessment or intervention. So one of the things that we would look to do in a crisis management brief is to really educate people about the impact of trauma, and then to support a process where they can monitor for themselves how they're doing, but also so that their peers within the workplace can help with that monitoring as well, so that they can check out with each other how they're doing, and they can perhaps feedback and notice any changes. We'd want to make sure some of the real basics are covered. So making sure that they've got the contact details for human resources, for occupational health, whoever's responsible for providing workplace support. As I said, giving some reassurance as to the normality of expected responses, and really starting to think through what a buddy-buddy system might look like. Even at an early stage, we want to give some suggestions for coping strategies. So we would normally look for a crisis management brief to happen within the first 7 days post-incident, depending obviously on the nature and its complexity. This is another great forum for seeking feedback from those who've been impacted, to ask them right from the beginning, what do they need, what would be helpful, and then to use that to inform any longer term response. We'd want to try and give people who are attending a crisis management brief some kind of information about what to expect next, so that medium and long-term support. Often a lot of resources, a lot of time, energy, financial resources and other types of logistical resources are thrown in at the immediate aftermath of an incident, and sometimes that can then fall by the wayside over time, and that can leave people who've been impacted by a trauma feeling neglected or abandoned or overlooked over time. So one of the things that we would really urge organisations to do is to really plan out their response into those stages of the initial, the medium term and the long term. So rather than using up all of the resources in the immediate aftermath, to think about what's needed and when, and start to plan, so that we would still be checking in with somebody, say in 6 months' time, potentially even checking in with people in a year's time. We also want to make sure that people are aware that support plans are flexible and can be responsive. We want to remind people about connecting with their family and friends, and if there is available support for family members, to make sure people are aware of that. And of course, to give them opportunities to ask questions and seek further information. I think one of the best examples that I've come across recently in terms of facilitating connections, which hopefully brings it right back to its basics, is I did a piece of work a couple of months ago with a police force in Wales, who were looking at how they could provide and initiate peer support mechanisms when their road traffic policing officers had been out to a fatal accident. And I would say one of the most effective things that they did was to give everybody Greggs vouchers at the end of the shift and encourage them to go and get breakfast together. So when we talk about facilitating connections in particular, it really is that basic. It's about checking in with each other, seeing how people are doing, and anything that a company or organisation can do to facilitate those connections, be it Greggs vouchers or Costa Coffee vouchers. What we're saying is that you matter, and I would say that the best source of support in response to any trauma is what already exists within organisations and networks. Our fifth principle is about responding to identity and context. So this is really thinking beyond doing the same thing for everybody. So when we talk about accounting for identity and context, what it doesn't mean is that we have to have a great understanding of every different culture, faith, or set of circumstances that we might encounter. But what it does ask is that we really pay attention to any assumptions that we might be making about what people need and want in the aftermath of the trauma, that we try and withhold that judgment, we stay curious, and we really seek to understand how someone is experiencing what's happened to them and what they need. And this really links to thinking about the whole range of options for support that we should be offering. So many organisations have employee assistance programmes, which can be incredibly useful, but we would ask organisations to think beyond employee assistance programmes. So we have our therapeutic and psychosocial support. We have therapies, so things like counselling, psychotherapy, psychiatric care, so that might be about medication or further assessment. Thinking about things like workplace adjustments. This was obviously something that Lisa spoke about, having time away from work or time away from specific duties, alternative therapies. So, you know, what is it that does work for somebody? And as Lisa mentioned, the real value of having further assessment and training in driving in order to help her to manage that anxiety. So just to give another brief example, I supported an organisation to respond to a vehicle-based improvised explosive device in Afghanistan a couple of years ago, and I think there was about 120 members of staff who were impacted by the incident, and we also had 2 fatalities. One of the kind of biggest challenges was that we had different groups of staff from different countries, different nationalities. So the largest group were what we would term our expat staff, which are normally have some kind of military background. So we provided them with access to kind of very traditional forms of support, such as psychotherapy and counselling. But we also had a large number of Afghan staff who were from the local area. And so one of the things that we did for them was we found a clinic in Kabul. We went out to visit them and did some work with them to find out what kind of psychological support that they could offer. But when we went out to the group themselves to say, what is it that you need? What they asked for was paid time away from work, because they wanted to spend time with their family and friends and their communities, because that was their biggest source of support. So now whenever we're responding to incidents in other countries, we make sure that we have a full range of options for support for them to choose from, in recognition that people will need and want different things depending on identity and context. And finally, all of these principles build us up towards this idea of building strengths, and how do we move forward? How do we integrate what's happened? How do we make sense of it? And how do we move forward? And so some of the kind of key principles here around building strengths, normalising responses and avoiding pathologizing, really going back to our basics. So asking people what they need and want, making support available, which is very accessible to people, mobilising those social networks within the workplace, and really contributing positively to culture, performance and retention. So for anyone who works in organisations, you will know that a happy workforce is one that performs better, is one that stays and doesn't try and leave. So when we talk about building strengths, when we're asking for best practice in response to a traumatic incident, we also see that that has wider implications on reputation, on culture, performance and retention, and no doubt sickness and absence as well. Just to mention, there is some further training in trauma-informed practice, which is free to access. So if anyone does want to learn more about a trauma-informed approach to practice, this is available via Thrive London. And also to mention that we will be adding, hopefully early in the new year, a trauma-informed family liaison practice course as well, which is based on a piece of research that I've recently completed, which looked at the impact of the organisational response on bereaved military families following the death of a loved one while serving overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan. So very much thinking about it from the organisational response and what bereaved families in particular needed, and what was helpful and also what was harmful in terms of organisational response. And for anyone who has been following our press release earlier this week, we are also very pleased to be launching the National Centre of Excellence for Post-Crash Support, and to let you know that as part of that offer, we'll be providing responsive consultancy, which is a commissioned service providing expert guidance to companies with the idea of supporting them to integrate and deliver a trauma-informed response to those affected by road traffic collisions in the course of their work. So this has been informed by a piece of work that we're currently doing with Police Scotland, where we're providing their family liaison officers with responsive consultancy in recognition of some of the complexities that they would face in their work. And if you want to access this service, or if you have any questions about the service, then please feel free to email me directly. And thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Nikki. Fantastic as ever, and as trailed. So you lived up to the billing. Can I invite Mark and Lisa also to put their cameras back on now, because we've only got a few minutes left in our time together, but great to just spend a bit of time taking some questions that have come in. So thank you for those of you who've contributed those into the Q&A. Mark, I'm going to come back to you to begin with, because in one of your slides you talked about policy, and Lorna's asked about, where you can access that, and I can see you've already responded to say go and visit drivingforbetterbusiness.com. But like, I guess one of the questions is, what really starts to make the difference? What policies should people start to look at as a first priority, because sometimes these things can take a while to get everything into place. So I was wondering whether you kind of give some hints and tips on a start point, really.
Yeah, have a look at the policies on our line. It's difficult. It's like trying to choose your favourite child, this, isn't it, Dan? And I do have one, but I'm not telling everybody. I guess in conversations I've been having, bearing in mind an awful lot of the issues come from human performance measures. So make sure you've got good policies around fitness to drive and establishing a psychologically safe space where people can talk properly and openly about some of the pressures on their fitness to drive, etc., etc. I'm also very keen on, I suppose, three of them in particular, aside from that, is speed. There's a lot of discussion going in internally about whether speed is actually a crash causation, but it certainly makes the outcome worse. So management of speed within fleets and giving drivers the ability to identify appropriate speeds of driving. There's a few tricks and ticks in there about that. Distraction, primarily mobile phones. As I said in the presentation, I don't really see that a policy that says abide by the law is actually really a policy. So bite the bullet and go further than just banning handheld use of phones within organisations. And the final one for me is around seatbelts. A figure that staggers me every time I look at it is 1 in 4 of the fatalities on our roads weren't wearing a seatbelt at the time of impact. I can't think of any other word to describe it other than stupid. What a stupid way to die. So I'd look at those. The policies we built, I guess, initially with the SME kind of operator in mind, who maybe didn't have the resources or the ability to create policies, and that is a very positive outlet for these policies. And just to remind everybody, they're all free. What we actually found was an awful lot of more large and perhaps more businesses were expected to be a little bit more robust in their policies, accessing them as well and using them to check and triangulate against their own policies, when they got everything covered off, was it all covered off to the right standards? Yeah. But, sorry to labour the point, everybody, but, you don't stand a chance really unless you've got the bedrock, the foundation of a good set of policies behind it.
Yeah. And just to quick follow up on that, so you touched there on mobile phone use, and Nick Evans had raised about mobile phones and social media use in his question. And I guess what I was thinking as you were presenting is there's lots of stuff there about the human behaviour and human performance. There's also a lot that we can do as employers and businesses to use technology to enhance the safety of our fleet. How much can we expect people to deliver by embracing technology?
I think technology's got a fantastic potential to help mitigate risk, and I'm a big fan of driver behavioural telematics, inward-facing, outward-facing cameras and all the rest of it. But I think the very first question any business has got to ask themselves before they start implementing technology is that do no harm piece, is really think through not just the obvious consequences of it, but also the unintended consequences in terms of distracting drivers. There's a significant benefit for good, But at the end of the day, it's a myth that we can multitask, and the number one task somebody should be doing when they're behind the wheel of a vehicle is driving it properly.
Yeah, great, thanks. Nikki, I wonder whether I could come to you next. So actually, something that both you and Mark touched on was around establishing safety and talked about the culture of that. Mark talked about just culture. You also talked about accountability within that culture as well. And I was just wondering whether, sort of, we all of us who are road users make mistakes. There are errors, there are slips. Sometimes those end up with the sort of, the worst of consequences that we've described. What can organisations do that enable sort of us to be honest about sort of our mistakes, but also, to ensure that people understand that those who really have contributed to serious harm, that there is accountability in that?
Oh, I think it's probably a really tricky balance for organisations to have, particularly after a traumatic incident where emotions will be running high. So I think it is just about acknowledging that it's a difficult balance, and explaining processes, making sure that people understand what will happen, but also inviting people to share their concerns, share their experiences in a way that can feel that it's supportive. So whether there's a way of reporting that's confidential or off the record, alongside an investigative process, because I think it is about that balance of both, because otherwise people will feel like there's no room in between to make those mistakes and to get that support. So I mean, it obviously depends on resources, but in Lisa's case, for her colleagues hearing about her experience, one of the company responses could have been, if anyone else feels that they would also benefit from an advanced driving course, just to check out their driving, just to build their confidence, because you've heard her story and all of you have imagined that it was you in that situation. So what do you need? So I think I'm aware that that has huge resource implications for companies, but just thinking about the preventative aspect, but also the cultural aspect, to then have a driving instructor kind of pick you up for a few things that you can learn from, because all of us would have things to learn. But that's some of the things that I would look for a company to kind of intervene, so that they can demonstrate accountability, both in terms of what are we going to do about this, but also what are we going to do to prevent this going forward. And I think that's where we would want to go beyond policy to actual practice. And whilst that has, like I said, does have huge resource implications, I think the effects of it could be, well, they will be life-saving.
And if I can quickly make an observation about that, and it's just recent experiences. I've been involved quite a few companies are using the phrase blame-free culture. It can't be a blame-free culture. That's really a misnomer. There may potentially be blame at the end of it, but what they do need to demonstrate, and are demonstrating very well, some of the businesses I'm working with, is that it's a just culture, and that provides that room for people to manoeuvre. And to talk to Nikki's point, yeah, it can be a challenging, even expensive thing to set up in an organisation, but the benefits will pay for themselves very, very quickly. Crashing is quite an expensive hobby.
I was reflecting as you were talking, Nikki, about just the organisations that I'm involved with and the business that I run, and thinking, God, this could feel quite daunting for sort of particularly the SMEs. And then you talked about Greggs Vouchers, and I was like, there's a point that I can relate to, that actually there are things that even businesses that are small and of modest means can do to help make a difference in this area. Anything else you want to add on that?
No, I think just exactly that. I think we often get really overwhelmed when we talk about things like best practice, trauma-informed practice, and we get stressed and think that it's going to be really expensive, or it's going to be really complicated, or that you need some kind of expert to come in. But the idea about the Greggs Vouchers came from the chief inspector, himself. He thought, oh, what do people need? Oh, I know, everyone seems to go to Greggs anyway. Why don't we get them vouchers and encourage people to go? And it really is that simple. It's having a process of saying, look, can I take you out for a coffee afterwards? It doesn't need to be expensive. It doesn't need to be expert. It just needs to be human. And being human doesn't cost us anything, because we should want to be human all the time, because that's how we want to be treated. And I think it's really bringing it right back to that basics of just being human. What would you want from somebody? You'd want someone to say, how are you doing? Do you need anything? And that's all we're really talking about.
That's fantastic. I'm conscious of time, and we've sort of run up right up to time now, and I've got other questions that I wanted to fire to Lisa and others as well. But Ross, you've joined us online. We've got a couple of poll questions to ping out to people as we come into land. Do you want to introduce those?
I can do so. Yeah, just to say that there is, well, yeah, hopefully you can see it coming up onto your screens now. So there are some questions that are appearing just in relation to your experience of today's webinar and the session. If you could take the time, please, to complete those now, that would be really helpful for us. There will be we will be seeking some more detailed feedback from you. But if you could take the time to complete the poll, it's certainly appeared on my screen now, so I hope it's appeared on yours as well.
It's working for me.
That'd be much appreciated. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, so please be filling those things in, as we've already responded, as Ross said right at the start and also in the chat. The recordings from today will also be available on YouTube, and Brake will be sending out a link where available. So please do be following Brake's content through the remainder of Road Safety Week, but not just Road Safety Week, because whilst this is a key focus in the year, there's obviously much that's going on around the year to enable you to create work environments that are more supportive and safer and better places to be for your colleagues and your employees. So thank you very much for joining us. My thanks to Nikki, to Lisa, to Mark as well for their presentations, and to Brake for organising it, but also for you for joining us over the last hour and a half. Trust it's been a useful time for you, and look forward to seeing you at a Brake event again very soon. Thanks very much. Bye for now.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to our fantastic panel of speakers, and to Dan for hosting our session today. A final reminder, please sign up to Road Safety Week if you haven't done so already, and we'll be in touch with you following today's event. We'll share a recording, as Dan has mentioned, and please keep an eye out for those comms. You've got Nikki's contact details should you want to speak with her to understand how Nikki and Brake can support your organisation with next steps following today. And of course, it goes without saying that we'd love to hear from you as well if you'd like to talk to us about how you can support Brake's work moving forward as well. Thank you, everyone, for your time today, and have a good rest of the week. Thank you. Take care.